Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. The first fire made itself known by smell rather than sight. It drifted through the lower streets of Bracken Hollow just before sunrise. By the time smoke was visible, the town was caught in a gray interval between night and morning. Volunteer firefighters arrived to find the rear service door bowed inward and the interior scorched from floor to ceiling. The blaze had burned hot and fast, consuming rows of paper files before starving itself of fuel. Water pooled in the alley, carrying ash toward a storm drain that fed the creek below. The structure remained intact, but its contents did not. Entire shelves of permits, assessments, and correspondence were gone, reduced to damp black pulp. Initial explanations leaned toward accident. The annex was old, its wiring brittle, its maintenance deferred. But the fire chief noted the burn pattern and the way the heat had climbed the walls without spreading laterally. The damage was contained, almost careful. The origin point sat low and close to the shelving that held the most recent records. It was not how an electrical fire behaved. By mid-morning, the smell had spread across town. Shop owners opened windows despite the cold. The courthouse flag hung limp. People gathered at a distance, not out of panic but curiosity, speaking in muted tones as if volume might invite repetition. Bracken Hollow had not seen a deliberate fire in living memory. It was a place that prized predictability, where disputes played out in letters and meetings, not flame. The county assigned the investigation to Thomas Calder, whose reputation rested on patience and a refusal to rush conclusions. He arrived late morning and walked the alley alone, stepping carefully around damp ash. He traced the scorch marks with his eyes, noting how the heat radiated outward from a single point. Near the drain, he found a warped crescent of melted plastic, the remnant of a container that had not been meant to survive. The accelerant had been poured deliberately, not splashed or spilled. The fire had been designed to burn and stop. Calder spoke with the clerk, whose office had been damaged, and learned which records were gone. They were not the oldest files, nor the ones most often requested. They were recent, tied to land use changes along the creek, insurance adjustments, and a cluster of zoning variances that had quietly passed through the annex over the past year. The losses were specific enough to trouble him. He walked the perimeter of the courthouse grounds and noted how the annex sat near a service road that dipped toward the water, hidden from the main street by a stand of trees. It was a convenient place to arrive unnoticed and leave the same way. The town's geography, so familiar it had faded from attention, offered routes that favored discretion. That evening, Calder reviewed photographs and drafted a preliminary map. He marked the annex and traced the creek's course as it cut through town, skirting industrial remnants from an earlier era. He requested copies of recent property transactions and utility work permits along the water. The requests felt speculative, but the instinct behind them was steady. Fires that targeted paper often followed lines drawn in ink. The second fire came 2 nights later, before the town had settled back into routine. This one took hold at the abandoned feed warehouse near the rail spur, a long, low structure with a tin roof and boarded windows. It had been empty for years, its presence tolerated because it bothered no one. The blaze climbed into the rafters and lit the sky orange before it was contained. When it was over, the warehouse stood gutted, its interior a lattice of charred beams. The connection between the two sites was not immediately apparent, and that absence of clarity unsettled people more than certainty would have. The warehouse held no records, no offices, no obvious value. It sat near the creek, close to a service road, and within sight of the tracks. Calder stood in the gravel as steam rose from the ruin, and considered access and timing. Both fires had occurred when traffic was light and attention elsewhere. By the end of the week, Bracken Hollow had grown quieter. Porch lights stayed on longer. The library extended its hours without announcing the reason. Parents walked children to school even on clear mornings. Calder added a second mark to his map and drew a line between the sites that followed the creek's curve. It was not proof, but it suggested intent. The first part of the story ended with ash cooling and questions taking shape. The fires had not spoken loudly, but they had chosen their words with care, and Calder understood that listening would require patience. The third fire did not take a building. It burned a shallow oval into the ground beneath a stand of sycamores along the creek path, far enough from the road that it might have gone unnoticed, if not for the smell. A jogger reported it just after dusk, describing smoke that clung low and moved with the water. By the time firefighters arrived, the flames had already collapsed inward, leaving blackened soil and scorched roots that steamed faintly in the cool air. To the town, the fire felt pointless. Nothing of value had been damaged. No structure had been threatened. It was this absence of obvious purpose that unsettled Calder the most. He walked the perimeter the following morning, measuring the burn and studying how the fire had behaved. It had been fed just enough to mark the ground, and then allowed to fade. The pattern was controlled, deliberate, and oddly restrained. Beneath the scorched earth ran a buried conduit, installed years earlier when plans for a small processing facility had briefly moved forward before collapsing under regulatory pressure. The conduit still carried power and fiber, unused but maintained on paper. Calder noted its path and traced it back through town records that had survived the annex fire. It surfaced again near the feed warehouse. It passed within yards of the records building. The fires were not scattered. They were aligned. Calder expanded his review of property transactions along the creek and found a recent cluster of sales that shared little except timing. The parcels had been held by the same families for generations and sold within months of one another. Each buyer was a limited liability company with an unremarkable name and a mailing address outside the county. Individually, the purchases drew little attention. Together, they suggested consolidation. He requested corporate filings and followed the paperwork outward. The companies traced back to a single registered agent who specialized in insulating larger interests from scrutiny. Behind that layer sat a regional development firm known for riverfront projects and an aggressive approach to land acquisition. The firm had no official presence in Bracken Hollow, but its fingerprints were beginning to show. The town council met in the high school gymnasium, folding chairs arranged beneath banners left over from basketball season. Residents spoke of fear and frustration, of feeling targeted without knowing why. Calder listened from the back, noting which concerns rose first. People spoke about safety and property, about history and continuity. No one spoke of profit or leverage. The idea that the fires might be a tactic rather than a grievance had not yet taken hold. Late that night, Calder reviewed traffic footage from a camera mounted near the rail crossing. The image quality was poor, but patterns emerged with repetition. A white utility van appeared near both structural fires, passing through within minutes of ignition. Its plates were obscured by grime, its markings non-existent. The route it took hugged the creek and avoided the main streets, moving through town like someone who knew where eyes were least likely to linger. Calder shared the finding with the sheriff and requested discreet patrols along the service roads. He avoided public announcements. Whoever was setting the fires had shown patience and restraint, and Calder did not intend to provoke haste. He wanted observation, not reaction. The fourth fire arrived before dawn at the edge of town, where a weathered farmhouse stood on land that had resisted every offer placed before it. The flames took the porch and climbed the posts before being extinguished. The damage was superficial, but the message was unmistakable. This time, people had been inside. The owners escaped unharmed, shaken but resolute. Calder stood with them as daylight spread across the fields. He saw fear settle into something harder, a refusal to yield. The fire had crossed from symbol to threat, and with that shift came urgency. In the days that followed, Calder tightened the investigation. He pulled rental records and found a storage unit leased under one of the shell company names near the rail spur. Access logs showed late-night entries that aligned with the fires. He obtained a warrant and cataloged the contents. Inside were rolled maps marked with routes and notes, copies of permits, and a ledger that tracked parcels by resistance rather than value. The pattern was no longer subtle. The fires traced pressure points along the creek, targeting records, infrastructure, and resolve. They were meant to unsettle, to accelerate decisions that had stalled. Calder assembled the timeline carefully, aware that intent would matter as much as action. As the second part of the story closed, Bracken Hollow felt watched. The creek moved steadily through town, carrying reflections of porch lights and the memory of smoke. Calder knew who he was looking for now, but knowing and proving were separate tasks. The fires had outlined a strategy. The next step would be to catch it in motion. Calder understood that haste would undo the work already done. The fires had been careful, and the person setting them had shown discipline. An arrest made on partial evidence would fracture the case and leave room for doubt. Instead, Calder focused on creating conditions that would draw the arsonist back into the open, a final act that would confirm intent beyond inference. The opportunity came through paperwork. A new zoning notice was scheduled for posting at the records annex, a reconstructed filing that addressed several of the creekside parcels now held by the shell companies. The notice represented a delay, a procedural reset that threatened to stall development timelines by months. Calder arranged for the posting to occur quietly on a Friday afternoon, with no public announcement beyond the legally required notice. He coordinated with the sheriff to stage unmarked vehicles along the service roads and positioned a thermal camera near the sycamore grove where the ground fire had burned. Fire crews were alerted but kept off site. The plan relied on patience and stillness, allowing the town to appear asleep while remaining alert beneath the surface. Night settled slowly. The creek reflected the moon in broken strips of light. Near midnight, the utility van appeared at the edge of town, moving without headlights along the familiar route. Calder watched from a distance, noting how the vehicle coasted rather than braked, how it stopped short of the alley and waited. The driver sat still for several minutes, as if listening for something that never came. When the figure emerged, Calder saw the same careful economy of movement he had inferred from the burn patterns. The person carried a flat container and a cloth, walking close to the wall to avoid casting a shadow. The accelerant was applied in a narrow line, precise and measured. The match had not yet been struck when Calder gave the signal. The arrest was quiet. There was no attempt to run. The man complied, setting the container down with care. His name was Andrew Miller, a regional operations manager for the development firm Calder had been tracking. He wore clean work boots and gloves that suggested preparation rather than impulse. In the van, investigators found additional containers, rags, and a printed schedule that aligned with past fires. Miller was transported without incident. Calder returned to the alley and stood where the fire would have begun. He imagined the flame rising, brief and hot, doing its work before vanishing. The interruption felt like a necessary ending to a sentence that had gone on too long. Over the following days, Calder rebuilt the case methodically. He matched the accelerant to residues recovered from the annex and warehouse. He overlaid GPS data from the van with the fire timeline. He cataloged the contents of the storage unit and connected ledger entries to specific actions. The ledger was spare but revealing, listing parcels by owner resistance and noting contingencies beside each. Fires were recorded as leverage, not destruction. Miller's account, summarized and corroborated through documents and digital records, outlined a strategy shaped by financial pressure. Delays threatened investor confidence. Records could be lost and rebuilt. Infrastructure could be compromised without lasting damage. Fear, properly applied, accelerated decisions. The porch fire had been an escalation, intended to remind holdouts that patience had limits. The town learned of the arrest through a brief statement issued by the sheriff. There were no details, no speculation. People filled the gaps themselves, piecing together the story from what they had seen and smelled over the past weeks. Relief came quietly, mixed with a lingering unease that settled slowly rather than lifting all at once. Calder spent his final days in Bracken Hollow tying loose ends. He ensured that the destroyed records were reconstructed from backups and secondary sources. He coordinated with state regulators to review the development firm's activities across the region. He walked the creek one last time, noting where the grass had begun to reclaim the scorched earth beneath the sycamores. The fires had been meant to force motion. Instead, they had slowed everything, bringing scrutiny and consequence where speed had been the goal. As Calder prepared his final report, he understood that the investigation had reached its necessary conclusion. The remaining work belonged to the courts and to the town itself. The third part of the story ended with certainty replacing speculation. The shape of the crime was clear now, its logic exposed, and its author identified. What remained was resolution, a final accounting that would close the loop the fires had opened. Charges were filed on a clear Monday morning, the kind that arrived without ceremony and left little room for interpretation. Arson, attempted arson, and conspiracy were listed in careful sequence, supported by a record that moved cleanly from ash to intent. The paperwork was unadorned. It did not need emphasis. The ledger, the van's routes, the residues, and the timing formed a narrative that required no reconstruction. The development firm withdrew its applications within days. The shell companies dissolved quietly, their assets frozen long enough for civil actions to unwind the transactions along the creek. Parcels returned to their former owners or entered a holding pattern overseen by the county. The pressure that had driven the fires evaporated as quickly as it had formed. Miller entered a plea that acknowledged the facts without elaboration. There were no public explanations, no attempts to recast the fires as mistakes or miscalculations. The strategy had failed, and the record showed why. The court accepted the plea, and the case moved forward on a schedule that felt deliberate and final. The county rebuilt the records with care. Backups were cross-referenced with state filings and private copies held by surveyors and attorneys. The process was slow, but it restored continuity. What had been targeted for erasure returned, imperfect but intact enough to serve its purpose. The annex reopened with new wiring and a lock that clicked more solidly than before. Calder remained long enough to ensure the handoff was clean. He met with the clerk one last time and reviewed the reconstructed files. He walked the service roads and confirmed that patrols could return to routine. He closed the storage unit inventory and forwarded the final evidence logs. The work had narrowed to administration, a sign that the investigation had finished saying what it needed to say. On his final afternoon, Calder walked the creek path beneath the sycamores. New grass had begun to push through the blackened soil, thin but persistent. The water moved steadily, indifferent to markers and maps. He considered how the fires had been calibrated to appear small, to suggest inevitability rather than force. The calculation had been precise, and it had failed because precision leaves traces. There was no gathering to mark the end of the case, no statements beyond the necessary. The town did not need a narrative to replace the one that had unsettled it. Routine returned not as relief, but as confirmation that the disruption had passed. Now, let's get into the next story for tonight. By the second week of October, the cornfields outside Ridgway, Iowa, had been cut down to their stubble. The land lay flat and exposed, the soil dark and compacted from harvest machines that had passed through days earlier. From the county road, there was nothing to interrupt the horizon, except a line of bare cottonwoods along the creek and the low silhouettes of grain bins a mile off. It was the kind of openness that made movement visible and concealment difficult, which would later become a cruel irony. The manhunt began on a Tuesday morning, though at first it did not carry that name. It began as a welfare check, requested by a school administrator who had not seen Steve Morrison arrive for his custodial shift. Steve was reliable in a way that rarely drew attention. He worked nights, kept to himself, and lived alone in a rented farmhouse east of town. When he failed to answer his phone by mid-morning, the request was logged and handed to a county deputy with a list of other routine calls. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel drive, its mailbox leaning and unpainted. The yard showed signs of neglect rather than urgency. Leaves unmoved, a porch light burned out, an empty dog bowl overturned near the steps. There were no tracks in the gravel that morning, no fresh tire marks beyond the deputy's own. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air was stale and cold, the thermostat set low. Steve's boots were missing from their usual place by the door. What shifted the visit from routine to something else was the back room. The deputy found blood there, not in dramatic pools, but in thin, uneven smears across the concrete floor and up the side of a workbench. A hammer lay beneath the bench, its wooden handle darkened and sticky. There was no sign of Steve, alive or otherwise. Within an hour, the farmhouse was sealed, and the call went out to the county sheriff. By noon, state investigators were notified. By early afternoon, helicopters from the Regional Patrol Division began circling low over the fields, their shadows moving steadily across the exposed land. The initial assumption was that Steve had been injured and fled or been taken. There was no body, no weapon recovered beyond the hammer, and no immediate suspect. What investigators did have was a timeline that narrowed quickly. Steve had last been seen the previous evening at a grocery store in town, where surveillance footage showed him purchasing canned food, batteries, and a pack of cigarettes. He paid in cash. The footage captured him exiting the store at 8:43 p.m., carrying a single plastic bag. Ridgway was not accustomed to that kind of attention. By sunset, squad cars lined the county roads, and residents stood in small groups near their mailboxes, watching unfamiliar vehicles pass. Rumors moved faster than official information. Some said Steve had been involved in drugs, others that he had a history of violence. None of it held up under scrutiny. His record was clean, his employment steady, and his social circle was normal. The first concrete lead came from the farmhouse itself. Investigators cataloged the blood and sent samples for analysis. They noted signs of a struggle confined to the back room, with no disturbance elsewhere. There was no evidence of forced entry. Whatever had happened, it appeared to involve someone Steve knew, or at least allowed inside. They also noted what was missing. Steve's boots, his winter jacket, and a hunting rifle he kept locked in a cabinet were gone. His truck, an older model pickup, remained parked in the drive, keys hanging on a hook inside the kitchen. That detail unsettled investigators. It suggested that Steve had left on foot or been taken without his vehicle, an unusual choice in a place where distances were measured in miles and weather could turn quickly. As darkness fell, search teams were assembled. Volunteers from the fire department and local farms joined deputies to walk the fields with flashlights, their beams cutting across the stubble in slow, methodical lines. Dogs were brought in, their handlers moving carefully along the creek bed behind the farmhouse. The dogs picked up a scent near the back door and tracked it toward the water, where it disappeared among rocks and fallen leaves. The creek itself was shallow but fast-moving from recent rains. Its banks were slick, and the water carried debris from upstream fields. Divers were called but found nothing that night. The scent trail did not re-emerge on the other side. By the next morning, the case had shifted again. Forensic analysis confirmed that the blood in the back room belonged to Bradley Ellison, a man known to local law enforcement for a series of petty thefts and probation violations. Bradley did not live in Ridgway but had family ties in the area and was known to drift between towns, working seasonal jobs and staying with acquaintances. The presence of Bradley's blood reframed the scene. Steve was no longer the assumed victim. The hammer, once thought to be an implement of assault against Steve, now suggested something else entirely. Investigators began to consider the possibility that Steve had defended himself or worse. They moved quickly to locate Bradley, but his phone was disconnected, and his last known address was a vacant trailer outside a neighboring town. When deputies arrived there, they found the door open and the interior stripped of personal items. It looked less like abandonment and more like preparation. By midday, the governor's office authorized additional resources. Roadblocks went up on the highways leading out of the county. Alerts were sent to neighboring jurisdictions with Bradley's photograph and a brief description of the situation. He was now considered armed and dangerous, not because of any confirmed act of violence, but because of the unknowns accumulating around him. The weather shifted that afternoon. A low-pressure system moved in from the west, bringing wind and a steady, cold rain that flattened the remaining leaves and turned dirt roads to mud. The helicopters were grounded. Search teams pressed on, their footprints filling with water almost as soon as they were made. Late in the day, a farmer reported seeing a figure moving along the edge of his property near dusk, keeping to the tree line. By the time deputies arrived, the light was gone, and the rain had erased whatever tracks might have been left behind. As night settled over Ridgeway, the manhunt took on its true shape. The openness of the land no longer felt like an advantage. Every field, every stand of trees, every abandoned shed became a potential hiding place. Somewhere in that expanse, a man was moving without a vehicle, possibly injured, possibly armed, and aware that the landscape offered nowhere to disappear. The search paused briefly in the early hours of morning, not because of progress, but because exhaustion demanded it. Investigators gathered in the temporary command center set up in the high school gymnasium, maps spread across folding tables, coffee cooling untouched. They marked sightings, scent trails, and gaps in coverage, trying to impose order on a situation that resisted it. Outside, the rain continued, softening the edges of everything. The fields waited, silent and exposed, holding whatever secrets the night had allowed to pass through them. Morning came without clarity. The rain thinned to a mist that hung low over the fields, dulling color and sound. From the air, when helicopters were finally cleared to fly again, the land looked scraped raw. Brown rectangles of harvested corn broken only by drainage ditches and narrow lines of trees. There were no obvious places to hide, yet no clear signs of movement either. The openness that had first drawn confidence from search planners now began to work against them. Too much ground, too few certainties. Investigators shifted strategy. Overnight searches had produced nothing tangible, and fatigue was setting in among volunteers. By mid-morning, the operation tightened. Search zones were reduced and prioritized based on probability rather than coverage. Attention turned inward, away from the fields and toward motive. Steve Morrison's life was reconstructed piece by piece. Deputies spoke with co-workers, neighbors, distant relatives. A picture emerged that was consistent but thin. Steve had grown up 2 counties over, returned after a brief marriage ended years earlier, and settled into work that required little interaction. He paid his rent on time. He drank occasionally but not heavily. He hunted during the season and fished in the creek behind his house in the summer. No known disputes, no debts, no visible enemies. The connection to Bradley Ellison remained the only disruption in that quiet outline. Records showed the 2 men had crossed paths once before, nearly a year earlier, when Bradley had been cited for trespassing on school property after hours. Steve, working his custodial shift, had reported the intrusion. Bradley had fled before officers arrived, but was identified later through a combination of surveillance footage and prior contacts. At the time, it had seemed inconsequential. Bradley received a citation and a short probation term. There was no further contact documented between the 2 men. But investigators now wondered whether the encounter had lingered in a way no one had recognized. As that question took shape, a new development arrived from the lab. Blood spatter analysis suggested the injury to Bradley had been significant, but not immediately fatal. The pattern indicated a single blow delivered at close range, followed by movement. There was no evidence of continued assault. Whatever had happened ended quickly. That finding complicated the narrative further. If Steve had struck Bradley in self-defense, the question became what followed. Why leave? Why take the rifle? Why abandon the truck? Shortly after noon, a tip came in from a clerk at a hardware store 30 miles south. She reported selling a heavy-duty tarp, rope, and bottled water to a man matching Bradley Ellison's description late the previous evening. The man had paid in cash and appeared agitated, repeatedly scanning the parking lot before leaving on foot toward the highway. The timing raised immediate concerns. If accurate, it suggested Bradley was mobile, planning, and possibly setting up a temporary shelter. It also suggested he had not sustained injuries severe enough to prevent movement. The manhunt widened again. State troopers canvassed the area around the hardware store, focusing on abandoned buildings, culverts, and wooded tracks near the road. Dogs were deployed, but the trail fragmented quickly, broken by traffic and rain. Investigators faced a growing possibility that Bradley was deliberately avoiding detection, moving unpredictably rather than fleeing in a straight line. Meanwhile, a quieter line of inquiry unfolded back in Ridgeway. Detectives revisited Steve Morrison's farmhouse with fresh eyes. They searched not for evidence of struggle, but for evidence of preparation. In a hall closet, behind winter coats, they found a folded county map with several areas circled in pen. Public hunting land, a decommissioned rail line, and a stretch of river access 20 miles north. None of the circles were dated. There was no accompanying note. It was impossible to say whether the markings were recent or habitual. Steve hunted regularly. Maps were practical, not suspicious. Still, the discovery introduced an unsettling alternative. The possibility that Steve had anticipated something. That possibility gained weight when investigators interviewed a woman who lived half a mile from the farmhouse. She reported hearing a vehicle pull into Steve's drive late Sunday night, followed by raised voices drifting across the fields. She could not distinguish words, only the rhythm of an argument. Minutes later, she heard a sharp metallic sound, then nothing. She had not reported it at the time, assuming it was farm equipment or a dropped tool. The sound aligned with the hammer. By late afternoon, the operation faced two competing theories, neither complete. In one, Bradley Ellison had confronted Steve Morrison over the past citation or something else entirely, and been injured in the encounter before fleeing. In the other, Steve had been the one to leave, possibly pursuing Bradley or attempting to disappear after an act he believed he could not explain. The question of who was being hunted grew less clear by the hour. That uncertainty deepened when a rancher north of town reported finding a bloodied jacket caught on a fence line near the old rail corridor. The jacket matched the description of Steve's missing winter coat. Blood analysis confirmed it belonged to Steve Morrison. The location mattered. The rail line ran through dense scrub and uneven terrain, offering cover that the open fields did not. It also connected to multiple access points leading out of the county. Investigators stood along the fence as evening approached, the jacket fluttering lightly in the wind. There was no clear trail beyond it, only disturbed grass leading into thicker brush. The implication was unavoidable. Steve had been injured elsewhere, or injured later, and had continued moving. Night fell again with no resolution. The search perimeter was adjusted to include the rail corridor. Additional teams were requested. Helicopters prepared for thermal imaging flights once darkness settled fully. Somewhere between Ridgeway and the river access points marked on the map, at least one man was still moving. Whether pursued or pursuing remained unknown. What investigators now understood was that the farmhouse scene had not marked the end of violence, but its beginning, and that the landscape, so exposed in daylight, was offering just enough cover after dark to allow the situation to evolve beyond control. The first thermal flight lifted just after midnight, its path running parallel to the abandoned rail line. From above, the land resolved into gradients of heat rather than shape. The harvested fields appeared cold and uniform. Tree lines glowed faintly. Pockets of residual warmth clung to culverts, drainage pipes, and collapsed sheds where animals had sheltered from the rain. The crew flagged several anomalies, none of them human. Deer clustered near the river. A pair of coyotes moved steadily south. No single heat signature showed the size or pattern investigators needed. On the ground, teams advanced in narrow formations through the brush along the rail corridor. Progress was slow. Wet leaves masked sound, and visibility dropped to a few yards. The search was no longer about speed, but about containment. The assumption was that if someone was still moving, fatigue and injury would eventually force a mistake. At dawn, that assumption was tested. A utility worker checking a pumping station near the river access north of Ridgeway reported signs of recent use. The door to the small concrete structure was ajar. Inside, investigators found a makeshift resting area assembled from cardboard, a tarp, and rope tied to exposed piping. A half-empty bottle of water lay on the floor. Blood was present on the cardboard, smeared rather than pooled. The blood belonged to Bradley Ellison. The discovery confirmed what many had suspected. Bradley had survived the initial injury and had been moving deliberately, choosing locations that offered concealment and proximity to water. What it did not clarify was whether Steve Morrison had followed him there or arrived separately. Attention returned to the river. The stretch in question was wide but shallow, braided with sandbars and fallen trees. Recent rains had raised the current, making footing unpredictable. Search teams worked upstream and down, scanning banks and debris fields. Boats were brought in, moving slowly to avoid disturbing potential evidence. Late that morning, a diver located something lodged beneath a logjam downstream from the pumping station. It was a rifle, wrapped loosely in plastic and weighted with stones. The serial number matched the hunting rifle missing from Steve Morrison's farmhouse. The placement suggested intent. The rifle had not been lost in a struggle or swept away by current. It had been hidden. The working theory shifted again. Investigators began to believe that Steve had reached the river with the weapon and made a decision to discard it. Whether that decision came from fear, injury, or calculation remained unclear. What mattered was that he had continued on without it. Shortly after noon, a second item was found along the bank. A boot, half buried in mud, its laces still tied. It matched Steve's missing footwear. There was no corresponding track pattern nearby, only churned sediment that indicated slipping or a fall. Medical consultants were brought in to assess the blood evidence collected so far. Their conclusion was cautious but consistent. Steve had sustained an injury that would have caused pain and bleeding but not immediate incapacitation. He could have continued moving, though not quickly and not without leaving traces. Those traces were becoming harder to follow. The weather cleared briefly that afternoon, allowing helicopters to resume thermal sweeps farther north. In one pass over a wooded ridge near the county line, an operator detected a faint heat source that appeared stationary. Ground teams were dispatched, moving carefully through the area. They found no one. What they did find was evidence of recent passage. Broken branches, a flattened patch of grass. A discarded food wrapper traced back to the grocery store where Steve had last been seen. There was no blood at the site, only signs of rest. The implication was unsettling. Someone was staying just ahead of the search, stopping long enough to recover, then moving on again. As daylight faded, investigators narrowed their focus. The river, the rail line, and the marked hunting land formed a rough triangle of movement. The distances between them were manageable on foot if approached methodically. It suggested planning rather than panic. That planning raised an unspoken question within the command center. What if Steve Morrison was not fleeing, but hunting? The question gained weight when forensic analysts completed a more detailed review of the farmhouse scene. They concluded that Bradley Ellison had been struck from behind. The angle and placement of the blow indicated surprise rather than confrontation. There were no defensive wounds on Steve's blood samples collected later, only evidence of injury consistent with a fall or secondary altercation. The timeline no longer supported a simple act of self-defense. By evening, the manhunt entered a more dangerous phase. Officers were briefed to consider both men as potential threats. The assumption of a single suspect dissolved into a moving, unresolved confrontation somewhere in the northern stretches of the county. Roadblocks were reinforced. Night vision equipment was distributed. Search teams were instructed to move with increased caution. Spacing widened. Weapons ready but restrained. Just after midnight, a call came in from a rural homeowner near the county line. Motion lights had activated repeatedly near a barn on his property. When he checked from a distance, he believed he saw two figures moving along the tree line. Not together, but not far apart. By the time deputies arrived, the barn was empty. The ground outside showed overlapping footprints leading in different directions. Some fresh, some partially washed away. Among them were drag marks that ended abruptly near the edge of the woods. There was blood again, this time from both men. For the first time, investigators could no longer assume a single trajectory. Whatever had begun in the back room of Steve Morrison's farmhouse had splintered into something more complex. The manhunt was no longer about locating a fugitive. It was about intercepting an ongoing conflict, moving through terrain that offered no clear lines and no certainty about who would emerge alive. The search continued into the early morning hours, slower now, more deliberate. Each sound carried farther in the quiet. Each shadow demanded attention. Somewhere ahead, the distance between the two men was closing or had already closed, and the next discovery would not be as ambiguous as the last. The confrontation ended just before dawn, though no one witnessed it directly. Search teams moving east through a wooded ravine near the county line found the final scene in stages, as if the landscape revealed it reluctantly. First came a trail of disturbed leaves leading downhill toward a narrow bend in the river. Then a concentration of blood on exposed roots, darker and heavier than before. Finally, near the water's edge, the body of Bradley Ellison. He lay partially turned toward the river, one arm submerged, the other pinned beneath his torso. The injury that ended his life was blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a single, decisive strike. There were no signs of restraint, no evidence of prolonged struggle. Whatever happened there had been brief and final. A short distance away, investigators found the hammer. It rested against a rock, clean of most blood but marked with fresh scratches along the metal head. The position suggested it had been placed rather than dropped. Nearby, impressions in the mud showed two sets of footprints converging, then only one leaving. The absence was immediate and unmistakable. Bradley Ellison's injuries told a clearer story now. Medical examiners determined that the initial blow at the farmhouse had caused a concussion in a skull fracture that would have disoriented him but allowed continued movement. Blood loss had been moderate. He had survived long enough to travel miles, rest, improvise shelter, and attempt to evade pursuit. Steve Morrison's condition had been harder to reconstruct until this point. The blood evidence found earlier along the rail line and riverbank was consistent with a fall rather than an attack. Investigators concluded that Steve had likely injured himself while moving quickly through uneven terrain, possibly during the night when visibility was limited. The injury would have slowed him, but not stopped him. The sequence that emerged was no longer speculative. Bradley Ellison had come to the farmhouse late Sunday night, likely intending theft rather than confrontation. Steve Morrison had surprised him in the back room. Instead of calling for help, Steve struck Bradley from behind with the hammer. The reason for that choice was never fully established. What was clear was that Steve did not wait to see the outcome. He gathered supplies, took the rifle, and left. Bradley recovered enough to follow. What unfolded over the next 2 days was not flight, but pursuit moving back and forth across the same terrain. Bradley stayed near water and cover, improvising shelter and supplies. Steve tracked him methodically, using familiarity with the land rather than speed. The map found in the farmhouse was not preparation for escape, but reference for movement. The rifle was never used. Investigators believe Steve discarded it once he realized it made noise and limited his mobility. The final encounter by the river did not involve a firearm, only the same tool that had started everything. After the body was recovered, the manhunt shifted one last time. Steve Morrison was no longer considered missing. He was now the sole subject of the search. That search did not last long. Just after noon, a state trooper spotted a man matching Steve's description walking along a gravel road 5 miles north of the river site. He was moving slowly, favoring one leg, his clothing stained and torn. When approached, he did not run. He offered no resistance. Steve Morrison was taken into custody without incident. He was treated for dehydration, exposure, and a deep laceration to his lower leg that had gone untreated for days. During questioning, he provided a detailed account of the events without visible emotion. He did not deny striking Bradley Ellison at the farmhouse or at the river. He framed his actions as necessary and inevitable. Investigators noted that his statements aligned closely with the physical evidence. There were no grand justifications, no attempts to reshape the narrative. He described the pursuit as something that could not be stopped once it began. Charges were filed within hours. The operation wound down quietly. Roadblocks were lifted. The command center in the high school gymnasium was dismantled. The helicopters left first, then the state units, and finally the out-of-county deputies. Ridgway returned to its routines with little ceremony. The farmhouse east of town remained sealed for weeks. The fields around it stayed bare through the rest of the season, exposed and empty. By winter, the case had moved fully into the court system, and the land held no visible trace of what had passed through it. The manhunt had ended not with a chase or a standoff, but with a convergence, 2 paths narrowing until only one continued on. Now, let's get into the next story for tonight. The town of Alder Creek sat low against the eastern edge of the plains, where the land flattened and the sky widened into something that felt exposed rather than open. Grain silos rose at the outskirts like concrete sentinels, their surfaces stained by decades of wind and rain. Beyond them, county roads extended in straight, patient lines, disappearing into fields that shifted color with the season. In late October, the harvest had already passed, leaving the land pale and stripped, the soil pressed flat and waiting. Alder Creek had fewer than 5,000 residents, most of them living within a tight grid of streets that surrounded the courthouse square. The buildings there were modest and orderly. Brick storefronts with faded signage, a diner that closed before sunset, a hardware store whose windows displayed tools arranged with deliberate care. At night, the town quieted completely. Porch lights remained on, but little else moved. Sound carried easily in those hours, traveling farther than it should. On the morning of October 18th, the stillness broke just after dawn. A delivery driver turning off County Road 6 noticed a pickup truck stopped along the shoulder, angled slightly toward the ditch. Its hazard lights were off. The engine was cold. One tire sat lower than the others, half sunk into the soft ground where rainwater had collected earlier in the week. At first glance, it looked like a minor breakdown, the kind that would be resolved later in the day with a tow and a resigned shrug. But the driver noticed the door. The driver's side door was open wide, its edge pointing toward the road, as if the person who had exited had done so quickly, without care. Inside the cab, papers lay scattered across the passenger seat. A thermos had tipped onto the floorboard, its lid missing. There were no signs of struggle visible from the road, nothing overtly violent. But the longer the driver looked, the more the scene resisted easy explanation. The driver called it in. By the time the sheriff's department arrived, the sun had climbed high enough to pull the fog from the ditches. Deputies stood along the shoulder, hands resting on their belts, scanning the field beyond the truck. The grass there was flattened in uneven patches, darkened where moisture still clung to the stems. About 30 yards in, near a line of cottonwoods that followed the curve of a shallow creek bed, something darker interrupted the uniform color of the land. They found the body there. The man was later identified as Daniel Harper, age 46, a lifelong resident of Alder Creek. He lay on his back, arms positioned unnaturally close to his sides, as if they had been placed there. His jacket was unzipped despite the cold, and one shoe was missing. There was no wallet on him, no phone. His face showed no immediate signs of trauma, but the ground beneath his head was damp in a way that did not match the surrounding soil. Daniel Harper was not a man accustomed to risk. He worked as a regional insurance adjuster, a job that kept him on the road during the week and home most evenings by 6. He lived alone in a small ranch-style house on Willow Lane, its yard neatly kept, its interior quiet and sparsely furnished. He had been divorced for nearly a decade, had no children, and maintained a predictable routine that rarely changed. On the night before his body was found, Daniel had been seen at the Alder Creek Market just before closing. Security footage later confirmed he purchased a frozen meal, a loaf of bread, and a bottle of orange juice. He nodded to the clerk, left the store, and drove west, away from his home. That detail unsettled investigators early on. Daniel had no known reason to be on County Road 6 that night. The road did not lead toward any business or residence he frequented. It cut through farmland and eventually connected to a neighboring county, but there was nothing along it that suggested a destination. No bars, no gas stations, no shortcuts that would have saved him time. When deputies entered Daniel's home later that morning, they found the frozen meal still in its bag on the kitchen counter. The lights were off. His bed had not been slept in. His work laptop sat open on the dining table, powered down mid-task. Nothing appeared disturbed. No drawers had been opened. No items missing beyond the phone and wallet that would normally be on his person. The autopsy was scheduled for the following day, but even before the report came back, questions began to accumulate. There were no skid marks on the road where the truck had stopped. The keys were still in the ignition. The gas tank was half full. Whatever had happened had not involved mechanical failure or a sudden accident. The sheriff, Thomas Keene, had been in office for 12 years and had handled most of the serious incidents Alder Creek had seen in that time. A bar fight that ended badly, a hunting accident misreported as something else, a domestic dispute that turned fatal behind closed doors. None of those cases had begun like this, with so little to hold on to and so many small inconsistencies. Keene instructed his deputies to canvass the area quietly. He did not want rumors spreading before they had facts. But Alder Creek was a town that noticed absence quickly. By midday, people were already asking why Daniel Harper's truck was still parked along the road, why deputies were seen walking the fields near the cottonwoods, why the coroner's van had driven through town without sirens. By evening, the news reached Daniel's ex-wife, Sarah, who lived 2 towns over. She described Daniel as cautious, private, and meticulous. He disliked surprises. He avoided confrontation. He did not take spontaneous drives late at night. She could not think of anyone who would want to hurt him, nor any reason he would have placed himself in danger. The autopsy, conducted the next morning in the county facility, complicated matters further. Daniel Harper had died from blunt force trauma to the back of the head. The injury was consistent with a single, forceful impact. There were no defensive wounds on his hands or arms. No bruising that suggested a prolonged struggle. Toxicology would later show no drugs or alcohol in his system. The conclusion was unavoidable. Daniel Harper had not died by accident. He had been struck once, with enough force to kill him. Where that blow had occurred, and why his body had been left where it was, remained unclear. The lack of additional injuries suggested either surprise or trust. The absence of witnesses suggested planning, and yet nothing about Daniel Harper's life hinted at secrets or enemies. His finances were in order. His work evaluations were unremarkable. His phone records, once obtained, showed routine calls and messages, most of them related to work. There were no recent arguments, no threats, no signs of escalating conflict. As night fell over Alder Creek again, the fields returned to their quiet. The cottonwoods stood motionless along the creek bed. County Road 6 remained empty, its surface dark and unmarked, giving no indication that anything out of the ordinary had occurred there. But the questions left behind did not settle as easily. They lingered in the spaces between known facts, in the unlit stretches of road Daniel Harper should never have been on, waiting for whatever came next to bring them into focus. By early November, the investigation had begun to contract. What had started as a broad search for motive and opportunity slowly tightened around a smaller set of possibilities, not because new evidence had emerged, but because most alternatives had quietly collapsed under scrutiny. Each eliminated theory left behind a negative space, a shape defined by what Daniel Harper's death was not. It was not random, it was not impulsive, and it was not loud. Sheriff Thomas Keene returned repeatedly to the same unresolved elements: the voluntary stop, the single blow, the missing phone and wallet, and the absence of any sign that Daniel had anticipated danger. Together, they suggested a brief encounter, measured, efficient, and purposeful. Keene began reviewing overlooked intersections in Daniel's life, not events, but patterns, not conflicts, but points of overlap. One such overlap emerged through routine rather than drama. Daniel's job as an insurance adjuster required him to inspect properties across 3 counties. Most visits were uneventful: storm damage, roof claims, crop loss. But in the 6 months before his death, Daniel had been assigned a cluster of claims tied to a specific stretch of land along the southern edge of the county, land that included, notably, parcels adjacent to County Road 6. At first, the connection felt tenuous. The claims themselves were ordinary, mostly weather-related. But when Keene examined them more closely, a subtle irregularity appeared. Several had been flagged for follow-up, not because of suspected fraud, but because of discrepancies between reported damage and physical evidence. Daniel had not denied the claims outright. He had deferred them, requested additional documentation, and scheduled return visits. Those follow-ups had not yet occurred. One property in particular stood out. It belonged to a man named Robert Ellison, a local landowner whose acreage bordered the creek where Daniel's body was found. Ellison had filed a claim for flood damage late in the summer, citing erosion and loss of fencing. Daniel's initial inspection notes were neutral but cautious. He had requested soil assessments and historical water flow data, delaying payout. Ellison, according to records, had called Daniel twice in the weeks that followed. Those calls had gone unanswered. When deputies visited Ellison's property, they found a man in his early 60s, physically capable, outwardly cooperative. He expressed surprise at Daniel's death and mild frustration over the delayed claim, but nothing in his demeanor suggested agitation. He stated he had not seen Daniel since the initial inspection. On the night of October 17th, he claimed to have been home alone. Keene noted the location. Ellison's property was less than half a mile from where the truck had been found. That alone was not enough. Investigators continued building a timeline around Ellison, cross-checking statements against available data. There were no witnesses to contradict his account. No cameras pointed toward his driveway. His phone record showed no calls to Daniel that evening. The prepaid phone tied to the missed call remained unlinked to any known individual. For a time, the trail cooled again. The shift came from an unexpected angle, a delayed forensic result from Daniel's clothing. During secondary analysis, technicians identified trace amounts of clay soil embedded in the fabric of Daniel's jacket and pants. The composition was unusual, distinct from the topsoil common to most of the county's farmland. It contained a high concentration of bentonite, a type of clay typically found closer to the creek beds and erosion zones along the southern parcels. When samples from Ellison's property were tested, they matched. The finding did not place Ellison at the scene, but it placed Daniel on Ellison's land, or very near it, shortly before his death. That contradicted Ellison's statement that Daniel had not returned since the summer. Keene ordered a second interview. This time, The questions were narrower, the margins smaller. Ellison maintained his story, but appeared less certain in its details. He acknowledged that Daniel had mentioned scheduling a follow-up visit, but insisted no date had been set. When asked whether he had contacted Daniel on the evening of October 17th, he denied it again. Keene did not press. Instead, he requested consent to search Ellison's outbuildings. The search yielded nothing overtly incriminating. No weapon, no blood. But in a utility shed near the creek, deputies found a stack of burned paper fragments in a metal drum. Most were unidentifiable. A few contained partial letterheads consistent with insurance documentation. It was not illegal to burn paperwork. But it was notable. The final piece came quietly, without confrontation or spectacle. A technician reviewing cellular data noticed a brief activation of the prepaid phone 3 days after Daniel's death. It had connected to a tower near a rural supply store 20 miles south. Surveillance footage from the store showed a man matching Ellison's build, purchasing gloves and engine oil. His face was partially obscured by a cap, but his truck was identifiable. When confronted with this information, Ellison's posture changed. He did not confess. He did not deny. He simply stopped elaborating. Keene requested an arrest warrant. The theory prosecutors advanced was restrained and specific. Daniel Harper had contacted Ellison to schedule an unscheduled follow-up inspection, likely prompted by unresolved discrepancies. Ellison, aware that the inspection could jeopardize his claim or expose misrepresentation, arranged to meet Daniel along County Road 6 near the property line. The location offered privacy without attracting attention. The meeting had not escalated into an argument. There was no evidence of prolonged conflict. Instead, investigators believed that Ellison struck Daniel from behind once with a heavy object, possibly a tool kept on his land, killing him instantly. He then moved the body into the field, took Daniel's phone and wallet to delay identification and tracking, and left the truck where it sat. The act was not impulsive. It was controlled. Ellison was charged with second-degree murder. As the case moved toward trial, Alder Creek returned gradually to its routines. The fields changed color. The roads emptied and filled again. The spot near the cottonwoods remained unmarked, indistinguishable from the rest of the land. What lingered was not fear, but a quieter unease, the recognition that the crime had not required rage or chaos, only proximity and opportunity, and that was enough.